Well, good morning, everyone. There is a handout called Hope for the Depressed. If you don't have a handout, would you raise your hand? And if you don't have one, Philip will find you and get you one if we still have any left over. Thank you so much. So I want to ask you a question this morning, and you just keep your hand up till Philip finds you. But I have a question for all of us this morning, and I hope you take this question very personally because I have, and it has really changed the trajectory of my walk with the Lord and my personal ministry of the gospel. This question is, in a world of hurting relationships, personal struggles, and deep pain, why is the church not leading the way with loving concern? In a world of hurting relationships, personal struggles, deep pain, why is the church not leading the way with loving concern? You know, we all have friends, family, co-workers that are in strained, painful relationships. We may personally have struggles, or we know people that are having struggles. We may be going through a season of pain, or maybe we're coming out of a season of pain, or maybe we know other people who are hurting. And I want to ask you the question, do you realize that you are part of God's solution? The church of Jesus Christ is his instrument of bringing hope and encouragement and discipleship and caring concern for the community that we live in. And so that means we all have a role to play. And I hope this morning you're encouraged by our speaker, Dr. Tim Alchin, who's going to be telling us about how we can consider caring like Christ and how we can walk hand in hand with others in caring concern. And so I hope by the time we leave our worship this morning that we'll all have a better understanding of how we can actually be an answer for people who are hurting, who have questions, who are having struggles, that we might have solutions and answers and help for them. So I don't want to belabor my speaking anymore and take away any more Tim's time. Dr. Tim, come up and share with us what's on your heart today.
Well, thank you. It's good to be down here in Tennessee, and I brought my son Jeremiah with me, and just been able to see this beautiful part of the country where spring has already come. Chicago, we're on the verge of spring, but we're not quite there yet. You guys got the leaves and green and everything going, and hopefully we see that in the next couple weeks. But we're still dealing with a little bit of snow this week. So, but that's Chicago. But I'm privileged to lead the ministry of the Biblical Counseling Center, and Biblical Counseling Center is a ministry that helps churches develop leaders and develop teams of people to care for the hurting. And so we do that. We have counselors, but we also have a whole training program and training process where we work with churches in helping them develop leaders to care. And I don't know about you, but like if you look around the world and you look around even this town, there's so many needs and so many opportunities. And the church should be leading the way. I love what Robert Day just said. The church should be leading the way in providing answers and hope and providing care for the hurting. It's in the book of Ephesians, Paul talks about this volatility in the world. He talks about difficult times that come, and here's the way he says it. And I want us to hear this from Ephesians 4, verse 14 this morning. He said, "So that we may no longer be children, tossed to and fro by the waves, and carried about by every wind of doctrine, by human cunning, by craftiness and deceitful schemes." It's interesting. He gives this picture of a child who's in the waves. I remember I grew up near Philadelphia, and we would go every summer down to the Jersey Shore. And at the Jersey Shore, the waves, particularly in times of storms, would get pretty big. And I remember one time around 8 years old being out in the waves and recognizing that I couldn't get back in. And I was stuck in the waves, and the waves were coming, and you know what? The water was rushing out as fast as it was coming in, and there was a storm that was coming in. And it was a scary feeling like you're helpless, right? You'd get so far back in, and then you'd be pulled right back out, right? And you wonder how this is going to end. Thankfully, one of my sister's older friends recognized what was going on and came, and he pulled me sideways. Now, why did he pull me sideways? Because you're caught in the rip current, right? You're caught in the current that's pulling you back out, right? And so he pulled me sideways and had to pull me significantly down the shore in order to get me out. But that's the word picture that's being used here in Ephesians 4. Somebody who's caught in the waves of life, he's caught in the difficulties of life, and they can't find themselves out. Now, why are they being caught? Well, it says they're being tossed about by believing the wrong things about life, right? By human cunning, right? They've been tricked into believing that life works a certain way and finding out that life doesn't work the way that they think that it should work. By craftiness and deceitful schemes, they're being battered by the relationships that are around them and by the circumstances of life and the temptations that they're facing. And at the crisis times in our life, we can feel like helpless children too. We feel like we're stuck. Whether that being stuck is in a difficult marriage, or whether that being stuck is in an addiction, or whether that being stuck is in a season of depression, which we're going to look at this morning, we feel stuck. And volatility is the reality of life for many people who will walk into church this morning. They may not look it on the outside, but if you knew their true emotions, you knew what kept them up last night as they turned and tossed back and forth in their bed. Life doesn't feel safe or calm or normal. It feels difficult. And volatility is the reality of many people who walk into church. Life is battering and bruising them, just like the waves. They feel like this child that is tossed into the roaring ocean, helpless and wanting help. Now, if you were a literal child stuck in the waves, what would you hope for? What would you want? What would be beneficial to you if you're the child who's stuck out, unable to come in? You would need a rescue. Someone with experience. Someone with strength. Someone who knows how to get your feet back on solid ground. In fact, Jesus used the same metaphor when he talked about the way that life works, right? He said, build your life on the solid rock. Build your life on the foundation. When the storms come, your house will not collapse. So Jesus used the same picture and same analogy. Now, most often the waves of life are emotional, spiritual, and the relational struggles of life. What do we need when we experience these kind of trials? So Ephesians 4 talks about some of the ways that a church can be prepared for the trials of life. And so what I want to talk about, just kind of by way of introduction this morning, before we hop into our lesson on depression, is this. Why should a church like yours prepare leaders to walk with people through the storms of life? Why should a church like yours prepare leaders to walk with people through the storms of life? Is that what it takes in order to help people navigate the storms of life successfully? And I want us to look at Ephesians 4, and Paul answers that question for us. He says, before times of struggle, your church needs the mature to lead. Now, some of you in here would say, you know what, God's given me a walk with God, and God's given me a testimony, and God's given me experience. And I would tell you, in order to navigate the storms, Paul would say, you need the mature to lead. He says it this way. He gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the shepherds, the teachers, to equip the saints for the work of the ministry, for the building up of the body of Christ, until we all attain the unity of the faith of the knowledge of the Son of God, to mature manhood, for the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. In the storms of life, we need leaders that know their way to safer waters and solid footing. The reality is that I needed an experienced lifeguard when I was stuck out in the waves, right? That's why they're there, because they understand, they can see what's happening. a rescue captain in the Coast Guard is equipped to come and train people whose boats are going under. Similarly, the church needs to have the roles of leadership and move beyond the public platform to equipping people to do the personal ministry of the word. And so Paul makes it clear. He says, if we're going to be effective in helping people through the storms of life, that it isn't going to be just because we have a pastor. It's going to be because the pastors are equipping the people to walk with those who are struggling. So part of what we're talking about this morning, and part of what we did training all day yesterday, was your pastor and your leaders here have a passion to make sure that more of you are able to walk with the storms, walk through the storms that are sure to come. They're seeing more people walk through these doors who need help. That's a good thing. It's a good thing that you have more people walking through these doors that need help. It's a good thing when new and younger families are coming. But God says, in order to navigate the storms of life, the mature need to lead. You need to be equipped to lead. Some of what your church is going to be doing over the next year is equipping some of the senior saints in here and some of those of you who are even younger with maturity, how to walk with the hurting. What a beautiful vision, right? What a beautiful vision that no one has to walk alone. Do you get that? What a great thing it is when people are turning to your church and saying, I need help, and they're able to find it. That your church is leading the way. That people would drive by and they'd see this church and they go, that's the church that cares for people. That's what they do in there. They don't just get together and have a nice show on Sunday morning. People walk out and they feel loved and cared for. Paul gives a second thing. He says, well, how do we equip the saints? Verse 15 of Ephesians 4, he says this. Rather, speaking the truth in love, we are to grow up in every way into him who is the head, into Christ. Where do we turn for perspective in times of trouble? Well, we turn to those who can speak the truth in love to us. Churches that speak the truth in love stand out. Some churches speak the truth in anger. But you guys can be a church that speaks the truth in love. And it's a powerful dynamic when people are going through the storms of life. He continues down in verse 16. He says, from whom the whole body, joined and held together by every joint with which it is equipped, when each part is working properly, makes the body to grow, so that it builds itself up in love. It's said in many churches that 20% of the people do 80% of the work. Okay? But Ephesians 4 warns us against this mindset. It says if your church is going to be a church that cares for people through the storms of life, it says everyone has to do their part. Everyone's called to do their part. That everyone has a role to play. Not everybody's going to be a pastor. Not everybody's going to be a stand-up front teacher. But everybody has a role to play. As we care for the hurting, everyone has a role to play, a gift to give, and resources that benefit the growth processes of others. You just have to be willing and be committed. There's many practical ways that even new believers can be involved in caring for the hurting while maturing for greater shepherding roles that come over time. Not everybody needs to be a counselor. Not everybody needs to be a pastor. Not everybody needs to be the same thing. But here's the challenge that I'm going to lay out for you this morning. As your church thinks about care and thinks about how to walk with people through the struggles of life, do you see the hurting around you? And does that burden you? And you may go, well, I don't even know what I could do that would be helpful. And let me just challenge you to be open to that question. Be open to that question as your church leaders wrestle with that. The question of, what could I do that would be helpful? Think about that for yourself. What could I do that would be helpful to people? God's given you a unique story. God's given you a unique background. God brought you through some difficulties in your life. And I bet you in a church this size, there's somebody else going through that same exact thing. I can almost guarantee you, right? That somebody's sitting in here this morning going through a difficult marriage, and there's someone else who's seen God faithful through a season of having a difficult marriage. There's some of you sitting in here wishing your spouse would come to church. And there's some other women who know the pain and hurt of that and would love to pray with you and encourage you. There's some who've gone through a serious season of addiction, and you found that Jesus was the answer. And now God might have you share that story of hope with other young men and other young women struggling with the same exact thing without judgment, because you know that by God's grace is the only way that you got better. You don't stand in judgment over them. You're like, let me help you, because there's a better way. Now, he finishes with a long passage from Ephesians 4, 17 to 23. And I'm going to read it, and then we're going to kind of hop into the lesson on depression this morning. But I want you to listen to the change process that Paul lays out in the book of Ephesians. He says, "Now this I say and testify in the Lord, that you must no longer walk as the Gentiles do in the futility of their minds. They are darkened in their understanding, alienated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them due to their hardness of the hearts. They become callous and have given themselves up to sensuality, greedy, to practice every kind of impurity. But that is not the way you learned Christ, assuming that you've heard about him and were taught in him. As the truth is in Jesus, to put off your old self, which belongs to your former manner of life and is corrupt through the deceitful desires, and be renewed in the spirit of your mind, and to put on the new self, created after the likeness of God in true righteousness and holiness." There's a growth process that all of us are on. We're on this growth process of becoming more like Christ. And he says we're putting off our old man and we're putting on the new man. We're becoming more of the people that God wants us to be. Now, here's the thrust of Ephesians 4, and here's what I want us to grasp with this. That takes all of us working together. But if you're going to navigate the seasons of life and you're going to navigate the storms of life, everyone's got a part to play. Everyone sitting in here this morning has some part to play in helping the other hurting around this church and around this community. Not everybody's going to do the same thing. But I'd ask you, okay, how would God use me to help more of the hurting that are walking through the doors of this church? That's what we're focusing on this weekend. Focus on how can this church be a place where more people find hope and help in their time of need. What a great thing. Like, God is pleased that your church is wrestling with that very question and saying, you know what? We are going to be equipping the saints of this church. We're going to be equipping more people at this church to have conversations to bring hope and help. And I just want to applaud your leaders for that. I want to applaud your leaders for having that vision, because I think it pleases God. Now, I want to talk this morning about a topic and a storm that we often face, and that's the issue of depression. And we picked depression because depression is something that I think almost all of us, in some season of our life, will experience depression. And all of us, almost all of us, will have a friend or a relative or a child who goes through a serious season of depression. And we talk about it in society, but we often don't talk about it, sadly, in the church. We don't often talk about the answers that God has for the issue of depression. And so I want to have a conversation. I want to be able to talk about that even this morning, and begin to wrestle with how might God use some of you to encourage those who struggle with depression in your own life, and in your church and in your Sunday school class. So many Christians wonder, what does the Bible even have to say about depression? I think typically in our culture, if we think about depression, we see a medical doctor on TV talking about medicine, right? That's often the approach that we hear when it comes to the issue of depression. And depression can be very difficult to express or understand, but we see more people are struggling with it. I want to look, I grabbed some quotes at the bottom of the ways that people describe depression, okay? And I want you to read on your handout with me. And these are just some quotes of people who struggle with depression that give us some idea of what depression feels like. It says, whenever I have a few good months, and I think I've gotten over the worst of my depression, it silently returns. This isn't a battle I'm asked to fight. I'm tired of knowing it's always coming back. I wanted to write down exactly what I felt, but somehow the paper stayed empty. And I couldn't have described it better. A blank page is all I felt. Another person said, no one realizes how strong someone with depression has to be just to do daily stuff like take a shower, brush your hair, or get out of bed. Another, when you're depressed, you don't control your thoughts. Your thoughts control you. I wish people would understand this. Someone else reminds us, he says, I'm not using my depression as an excuse. Trust me, I'd give anything to function normally on a day-to-day basis. There comes a point where you no longer care if there's a light at the end of the tunnel. You're just sick of the tunnel. There comes a point where you feel such a level of hopelessness and despair that you just want it all to be over with. Now, I would hope that all of us would feel a sense of compassion when you read people describe life these ways. If these were your friends, and this is the way they're describing how life is going right now, what would a Christ-like response be? Well, it should be a heart of compassion, right? Recognizing the suffering and the hopelessness that someone feels. We should have a godly sense of concern for them. It can feel hopeless when the waves of depression crash. Some waves feel bigger and some feel smaller, but they never seem to end. Many people wonder if the Bible even addresses the struggle with depression because the word depression doesn't appear in Scripture. However, it's important to know the major factors that lead to or increase depression. For example, feelings of depression are almost always a result of emotional stress. So I want us to see here that when it comes to how a biblical counselor would understand depression, here's what we're going to say. We're going to say that our heart, not our physical heart, but our heart, like our inner man, our mind, who we are, our soul, our spirit, and our body are in communication with one another. They're impacting one another. That we are not simply what our body is, right? We don't explain who we are just based upon how our body feels today. Yet, God's given us a soul. He's given us a spirit. He's given us a mind, the immaterial part of man. And our heart and our body are interactive. You think of the ways that our body feels and some of the things that are impacted by depression. You think of people who don't have an appetite. Their sleep patterns get off. Their sexual drive decreases. They lack concentration and energy. So if they were to go to their doctor and describe how they're feeling and what they're doing, those are often going to be the markers of depression. Now, but we also have a heart, right? Our heart is what we love, what we hate, our values, our commitments, our desires, what's important to us in life, the goals and perspectives that we have. And I want us to recognize that even though we often talk in our culture about just the medical side of depression, there's a spiritual side of depression that I would actually argue is more important than even the physical side of depression, that we need to come to grips with. And the Bible talks all about the experience of spiritual depression. Now, spiritual depression makes our body feel a certain way. And again, these, our heart and our body interact. But a couple observations I'd make from this, and I recognize for some this morning, you're going to be wrestling with this, because this might be different than what you've kind of read on the internet, or this might be different than what you have personally kind of seen or experienced. And I just would say, let's wrestle with this together, okay? But the first thing is this. Depression is more than biological. It's more than simply something that's happening in your body. Depression has a way of thinking, right? I remember I had relatives that grew up south of here in Mississippi, right? And I remember like thinking, because I was from Chicago, right, that my relatives from Mississippi were weird. You guys from Tennessee think Mississippi people are weird too, right? Right? Is that not right? Like, okay. But they were weird because they're from Mississippi, right? They're country Mississippi folks, right? And, but I remember the experience of hearing pretty awful racist comments coming out of their mouth. And being from Chicago and being from the suburbs, like, it wasn't something the way that I thought, right? Now, I hope we all would recognize now that racist thoughts are not God's thoughts, right? That God doesn't value, that God actually stands opposed to racist thoughts, right? But you can't medicate away racism. There's no pill to change it. Why? Because there's a value system, right, that says I'm better. Like I'm proud, right? I'm better than you, right? And so depression is more than biological. It has a way of thinking. And so there's not going to be completely a spiritual cure or a completely biological cure. A good counselor will address both factors in a way that's consistent with the biblical view of life in a fallen world. The second thing is this. Depression likely has multiple causes in most people. While depression has a greater physical cause in some people, it has a more circumstantial cause in others. And how we respond to circumstances and physical discomfort greatly impact the intensity and duration of the depression we feel. A good counselor will help you evaluate how you typically respond to life circumstances and whether those responses are helpful and consistent with the life that God desires for us. So depression likely has multiple causes in most people. It's hard to isolate a single cause of depression. But the last is just this. Depression is confusing and painful. It's incredibly difficult. And many who are chronically depressed find the cure elusive. They stay depressed for decades. In our country, we spend billions of dollars every year treating the feelings and symptoms of depression. And yet, it doesn't seem that we're any further along in our understanding of depression, our ability to treat it, than we were 50 years ago. A good counselor helps like a friend, bringing a comforting connection and gentle correction. We need comfort for our pain and God-honoring perspective for our confusion. A good counselor cares for you without having to know the exact cause of your depression. So I hope when you see those things that you recognize that a godly response to a friend or even to myself when I'm going through seasons of depression is to have a heart of compassion, to know they're suffering, they're going through difficulty, but to also to understand that it's not simply something like the flu that they just caught. Depression has a way of thinking that can be challenged, that can be shaped, that when a depressed person finds hope, it changes their experience of depression. When a depressed person finds peace, it changes their experience of depression. When they find purpose, it changes their experience with depression. Now, you think about hope and peace and purpose. That's what a church should be about, right? You think about what you celebrated last week in celebrating Easter. You're celebrating hope. You're celebrating the possibility of a new life in Christ because of what Jesus has done. So if we think about depression, though, we recognize that depression corresponds with the healthy expression of our emotions. And so one of the things that I do when I'm counseling and people come and they talk about a season of depression they're going through is I ask them their life story. And I begin to have them talk to me about the circumstances in their life and some of the things that they're going through. And I found that there's kind of 5 themes that I ask people to evaluate, and they're often present. And the first I would say is this: when anger is on overload, when somebody's a perpetually angry person, it's not long before they begin to feel feelings of depression. In fact, the Bible even talks about this. It says, don't let the sun go down upon your anger. Well, why? Because if we pick up tomorrow all the anger we had today, and we accumulate more anger tomorrow, eventually we get under the weight of such a burden that we feel feelings of depression. That anger corresponds with depression. The second thing is fear and anxiety. It's interesting that Jesus again tells us, he's like, don't worry about tomorrow. Well, why? He says, you have enough problems today. Like, don't worry about tomorrow's problems. Keep your mind in today, is what he tells us in Matthew. He says, cast all your anxieties upon me. Why? Because I care for you. Now, what happens if we accumulate anxiety day after day after day? Well, doctors would tell you that your body eventually begins to feel the weight of anxiety. Now, what happens? You begin to feel tightness in your chest. You begin to feel physical symptoms. You begin to wrestle with sleeplessness. Soon, you're in a doctor's office saying, I feel depressed. Yet, there's a correlation between our anxiety and the ways that depressed feelings come. The third, I would say, is just stress. I ask people to evaluate kind of their stress level. It's often that I get a call on a Monday morning. And I get a call on a Monday morning from a businessman. And the call from the Monday morning on the businessman is that he was in the emergency room on Friday or Saturday night thinking that he was having a heart attack. And he's a little bit embarrassed. You know why? Because the doctor told him you're having a panic attack. You're not having a heart attack. And he begins to unpack his stress level from the week before and find out that it was, an 80, 90-hour work week, and he took the jobs of 3 people upon himself, and he's dealing with all of these stressors. Now, the stressors for every person is different. What might stress out a mom, and what might stress out a busy man at work, and what might stress out somebody who's walking with a family member through a terminal illness. Like, you think about those 3 very different stressors. But there's a correlation between our stress level and our depression. In fact, God reminds us to rest. He reminds us to take time, to find a balance. And so, again, we see that there is a stress component when it comes to depression. The fourth kind of theme that I often see is guilt and shame. Now, guilt is really a position. It's not really a feeling, but people feel a sense of shame. Now, sometimes that shame comes about because they know that they've done something wrong. Sometimes that shame comes about because somebody has done something wrong to them. A child feels shame when they're abused. They take on the shame of their abuser. That's what they feel. They feel discredited. They feel unworthy because of what someone else is doing to them. A spouse in an abusive situation often feels that same sense of shame, like if only I could act better, he would stop hitting me. No, it's not the way it works, but we feel that sense of shame. So depression corresponds with a healthy with a healthy expression of our emotions, but when shame is present, we feel a sense of depression. Now, sometimes the shame is real, sometimes the shame is imagined, but either way, like that, it needs to be worked through, whether it's real or false. The last theme that I often hear when it comes to depression is just what I call broken relationships. And that can be through death. It can be the natural grief process. A spouse who loses their spouse feels a season of depression naturally because of the death, the distance, the loss of an emotionally meaningful relationship. That can be through divorce or dysfunction or distance or damage. All of those things, when we lose emotionally meaningful relationships, our body feels depression. Our mind thinks thoughts of depression. And so, how would we respond? How do we respond? And I want us to look here at the bottom. And one of the statements that I often make at this chart is this. I challenge those I counsel to realize that depression begins with disappointment. Depression begins with disappointment. When it comes to the way that depression thinks, I recognize that how our bodies respond, like everybody's body is different. But if we're going to address the way that depression thinks, the circumstances of depression, the things that actually are in our control, we have to recognize that depression begins on a disappointment level. And when disappointment is not dealt with, when disappointment isn't evaluated according to God's heart, discontentment can set in. Then ultimately despair. And lastly, destructiveness or desperation. So I would just say recent studies of individuals battling depression have identified that emotional stressors affect the way that we think and the feelings of depression, and they trigger waves of depressed feelings. So we cannot effectively deal with depression without evaluating our responses and emotional stressors of our life. And so the Bible provides a lot of guidance on how to respond better. So if we're going to make progress with depression, we're going to learn how to manage our emotional stressors in a way that God calls us to manage them. We're going to learn how to manage emotional stressors in a way that correspond with the truth of God's word. Every person has stressors that hurt them and distract them from living a full life as God offers. Depression begins with disappointment. Our emotional stressors are often rooted in a deep feeling of disappointment regarding something we had or lost, or something we longed for and never received. Do you get those categories? Depression is rooted in something we had and lost, or something we really wanted and never received. Depression is a progression which, when left unchecked, can go deeper and deeper. And no matter the cause of depression, God cares about what's going on in your depression. And he wants a spiritual response for us. You think about, how do we respond to disappointment? Look at this chart here. What's going on? Something unexpected or unwanted has occurred. What do? Well, you can begin to ask questions about the person's struggle. You can listen attentively for their affected goals and desires. You can ask people about their perception of God's role. What about discontentment? There's an unbiblical response to the disappointment. We feel like we have rights. We deserve this. Listen for what the person has lost. Listen for any of the blessings that have been lost sight of. Well, what happens if discontentment stays for too long? Well, ultimately, it gets to what the Bible describes as this despair. You see in the Psalms that David and Solomon and others came to a point of despair, of hopelessness. So if you had to pick kind of a biblical word that actually describes the experience of depression the best, probably despair would be it. But what's going on? The person sees no way out, is giving up, and is losing hope. I remember having a young man in my office in Chicago, and this was on the beginning of the week, a Monday or Tuesday, and he came because his family brought him there because he was suicidal in his intent. And he had told his mom that this was the last week that he was going to live. He had a plan. And he answered every question in my counselor's office. If I have to live past Friday, here's what I think. just to make a point, he kept answering questions. If I have to live past Friday. It's a little stressful as a counselor in those situations, right? To kind of think through, like, how do I give somebody enough hope that they'd come back next week? Right? Yet, here was a young man who was successful in his career early on. Got kind of caught up in substances and ultimately ended up losing a job. Ended up embarrassed, ended up in Chicago washing windows, feeling like this is pointless. He's humbled, right? Driving a bike around. He lost his driver's license and just didn't feel like life was worth going on. And thankfully, he had a godly family who kind of stepped in, who really fought with him and battled with him and kept him safe. And but it was a journey. You don't come out of that level of despair and that level of hopelessness quickly. And he tried medicine, he tried a whole bunch of things. But ultimately, he would tell you that what changed him most is that he found his hope and purpose again. He went and got a job in construction and just kind of started to work and started to wrestle with what was God's purpose. And, you know, even though he had a successful career early on, he recognized he couldn't go back to the same career he had, but he had hope and purpose. That young man is actually studying to be a counselor out of Denver Seminary right now in Denver, because God's given him a new purpose and a new passion for life. Now, it took 5 years. It took 5 years for him to turn through the season of depression. It doesn't happen often quick. Yet, God can pull us out of a level of despair. Now, what happens if we don't pull out of a level of despair? Destructiveness. There's deepening hopelessness and a reduced fear of death and harm. You know, this is where people do get suicidal, but it's also where people leave their spouses. It's where people drink too much. There's all sorts of ways that people find to deal with their despair. And it's all related to the way they're dealing with depression. Now, I want to finish with a little bit of hope. You think about stage one, difficult circumstances lead to disappointment and discouragement. It says, John 16:33 says this, "I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. That in this world you have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world." We can learn to address disappointments and discouragement. That's essential to being a follower of Christ. In stage two, we recognize that disappointment can lead to discontentment. Now, how do we help people wrestle with being content? Again, this is where many of you who are senior saints who've been through some of the difficulties of life and you found God's faithfulness, can I tell you that your story can be critical to helping younger people see contentment is possible despite hardship. You know what it's like to go through a difficult year of marriage. And some young people in marriage are like, you could go through a difficult year? Like, don't tell me you could go through a difficult year. And you're like, yeah, you could go through a difficult year. And God would be faithful. That if you prove your love in the hard times, that God will use that in your life for good. Now, none of us wants to go through a difficult year of marriage, but some of you would say, you know what? I know what that's like, to go through a difficult year of marriage. Paul says, not that I'm speaking being need, for I've learned in whatever situation I am to be content. I know to be brought low, and I know how to abound in every circumstance. I've learned the secret of being content, right? I've learned the secret of facing plenty and abundance and need. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Stage three, just discontentment can lead to despair. We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not driven to despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed. If we don't deal with discontentment, it leads to a level of hopelessness. And again, this is the way that depression often thinks. And so we want to avoid step 4, where despair can lead to destruction. It's illustrated this way. It says, "For we do not want you to be unaware, brothers, of the affliction we experienced in Asia. For we were so utterly burdened beyond our strength that we despaired of life itself. when the burden of life becomes so strong that you just want it to end. So here's what I want us to grasp this morning. That in your experience with depression, in your friends' experience with depression, in your family members' experience with depression, there's a spiritual battle going on, not just a biological one. There's a spiritual battle going on about how we're going to deal with the emotional stressors of life and how we deal with the discontentments and disappointments of life. And that is where a wise friend makes all the difference in the world. When you think about wise friendships and you think about people to walk alongside, like going through disappointments and going through discontentment and going through despair alone is incredibly difficult. God doesn't want us to go through those things alone. He wants us to have godly friends in our life, people that we can talk to, people who will walk that journey with us. And the more that you can experience that, and the more that your church can be that for one another, the more that you're going to be able to walk with people through seasons of depression, which sometimes don't stop really quickly. But you're able to walk with them and give them enough hope to keep going so that they can fight the battle in a way that they win, right? That they finish strong and they finish faithful to what God calls them to be and what God calls them to do with their life. So my goal for this morning was to help you to think. I know there's more notes on there. You can kind of read those. But, and there's a bunch of articles on our website, biblicalcounselingcenter.org. We actually wrote a whole series on that, on depression and kind of how do you respond to it. And so if you're looking for more information, I can certainly point you to that. But thank you for taking the time this morning to come. And I hope that you will encourage someone in your life with some of what you heard this morning. Be bold enough to speak some words of hope to people, because God is pleased when your church cares in the way that he cares. Let me pray and we'll finish. God, thank you for the opportunity to gather together in your house this morning. God, thank you that you have not left us without a way to think through even struggles like depression. God, your word reminds us of what we need. And we need you. And we need the hope that you provide. And we need the truth of Scripture that guides us. God, use this time today for good. In your name, amen.